like to propose we get rolling. Mike, Lisa, folks, that sound good?
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you very much to everybody for joining this evening's meeting of the Arlington County Water and Wastewater Rate Study Advisory Group. We are currently reviewing our agenda, and we'll be talking today about some project status updates, sharing a proposed rate structure and sort of how folks arrived at that and where we go from here, and then talking about next steps and public engagement planning. At that point in time, we will then have a Q&A discussion for advisory group members, and then we will open up the floor for public comment from members of the public that are joining this evening's meeting. We will ask until the public comment session that discussion is limited to advisory group members only. If we hear any background noise throughout the meeting, we will go ahead and mute your line for you. So just encouraging folks again to click that mute icon or mute your local phone device. If you find yourself on mute and you are joining only from a phone, you can unmute by selecting *6. But if you can handle that locally, that would be the most efficient for everybody. We'd like to ask advisory group members, this is our 5th meeting, so hopefully all of these things resonate and are consistent with how we've approached previous meetings, but please participate actively and respectfully. We want to make sure we're hearing all the great ideas and questions along the way. As I mentioned, to mute folks when you're not speaking, if you could avoid, if you are on the phone, putting the line on hold. While we all love a good standard hold music jam, we'll pass on that during this evening's meeting if we can. As we'd like to get into the conversation, there's a couple different ways to do that. You can verbally jump in and I'll keep a discussion queue. You can click that raise hand icon. That's that little hand icon that you'll see at I believe the top of your webinar screens in the top right. That'll automatically enter you into a discussion queue. Or if you have questions along the way or comments, you can use the chat as well as another way to get in touch with the project team and other participants to share questions or comments you might have along the way. And again, the conversation will be for advisory groups and between the project team and the advisory group members until we get to the public comment session at the end of the meeting. And then just another reminder here for anyone who's just joined us that this evening's meeting will be recorded for future reference. We're also taking detailed notes, and the PowerPoint presentation from this evening's meeting, along with the meeting summary, will be posted on the advisory group website when available. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Mike Collins to share an overview on Project Recap to get us moving. Mike, over to you.
All right, and I am just about recovered from my minor technical issue. All right, so we have here, it's been so long since we've seen everybody, been since March, that we thought we'd recap where we've been. So we started a little bit more, 14 months ago. Y'all came to the first meeting and we went over the details of what we were trying to accomplish. We reviewed the rates, the RSCAG's charge, and what we were trying to achieve and how rate studies work. And then we also gave a briefing on how our utility works here at the county. The next meeting we had was just a couple weeks later, about 3 weeks later, where our consultants, Bart and Will from Raftelis, really went into all the technical details of how you conduct a rate study, talking about all the foundational pieces of allocating costs, determining costs, projecting costs, and then the various tools that you use to construct a rate to achieve your objectives. We then had what I hope the group thought was a pretty fun tour. I know I thought I did, was we went and toured the water pollution control plant in December. And then meeting 3 was when the RSCAG really started to dig into and put their fingerprints on this rate study project, where we did an exercise in prioritizing values, community values that we wanted to see embedded in the rate structure. And that's going to be a lot of what we'll talk about today, is how the proposed rate structure reflects the values that we all heard from the community. On meeting 4, we talked a little bit about, or we held a meeting to talk about some of the special topics, some of the smaller, more esoteric topics about how a rate study or how a rate structure is implemented and how it affects our users in our community. And so here we are today, December 7th, 2020, where we're now going to roll out and illustrate the proposed rate structure and seek feedback on it. And so with that, why don't we go on to the next slide? So like I said, values, we're going to talk a lot about values today. And this slide here tries to illustrate how values can be reflected in a rate structure. And essentially there are multiple recognized common approaches to water sewer pricing. And there are different components and methods that can reinforce specific objectives or specific values of a community. So a critical first step for any utility is to determine which values are most important to that community, and then to start building a pricing model that reflects those values. And it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that some of the values that you may want to reflect in a rate structure may be in tension with each other. And so an obvious traditional set of values that are in conflict with each other would be economic development versus conservation. Those conservations really trying to reward a reduction in water use. Economic development traditionally, in a traditional utility sense, might reward more water use or make it more attractive, provide incentives for industries to move to an area. So, but that's the most common direct conflict between values. But all of the other values, like you might expect, they sometimes may reinforce each other in some ways, but can also be contradicting in other ways. Let's go on to the next slide. So we'll review now the public engagement. And we had developed, as part of this study, our sub-consultants, Kearns and West, Jason's group, developed, along with our internal communication staff, developed a multi-pronged community engagement plan. We were looking to utilize multiple vehicles, approaches, and mediums to hear from our community. And so our first stage of that community engagement plan had two goals. One was just to inform our community that the study was underway and introduce them to the process, get them up to speed on what we were doing. But the real most important goal of this first stage of community engagement was to seek their input on what values we should be prioritizing as we developed a rate structure. We had a couple different, like I said, a couple different mediums that we used for that. Probably the most successful tool we used in that first stage of public engagement was what's called it's a tool called 76 Engage. It's an online tool that allowed or asked our community to actually prioritize from 7 specific values that can be reflected in a rate structure. And the values we asked them to prioritize were conservation, simplicity of rate structure, affordability, equity among categories, revenue stability, and economic development. And so that tool was really neat. It it provided some education for people that used it, and then at the end asked them to prioritize those values. As you can see on the slide, we had 2,300 respondents, and from that tool, we had 2 very clear, overwhelming top priorities or top values, which were affordability and conservation. So if you move over to the center of this slide, the stakeholder advisory group, which is of course the meeting that we're talking about today, this was another real core component of our public engagement initiative. And the RSCAG was set up. It was selected, appointed by the county manager, and we asked for the RSCAG to be our liaison between specific stakeholder groups, and to carry back the message that we were bringing, but particularly to bring information in from their stakeholders, from the community, and bring it in through another channel. The photo that you see there is actually from, I guess it was our 3rd meeting where we did the prioritization, the values prioritization exercise with the RSCAG, and likewise, conservation and affordability were the two primary topics or primary values that were selected there. Then we had some other initiatives. We targeted multiple events and platforms to try and connect with our harder to reach populations. And so some of the tools, some of the venues that we used to try and do that was we hosted a table at the Latino Heritage Festival over at Arlington Mill last fall. We showed up at DHS immunization clinics and did what are called pop-up events there, where we just showed up and tried to engage with people. We were part of something called the Community Progress Network. And we also reached out through AED, Arlington Economic Development, went to what was called Arlington Premier Event. We met with a couple civic associations, chambers of commerce. So tried to reach out to to get as broad, touch the community as much as possible. And luckily, all of that first stage of engagement had wrapped up by the time that this pandemic hit. So we really were able to do all of that in our more traditional means and methods. So let's go on to the next slide. So here, this slide here is illustrating what I've already talked about a little bit in terms of what the answers were of the prioritized values of our community. And so all the multiple streams of feedback yielded two clear top priorities, which were affordability and conservation. That was pretty consistent through all of our streams. The number 3 priority, it was fairly distant from those top two, but it was a clear third, was equity across customer classes. So here, customer classes means commercial, multifamily, residential, high volume residential, low volume residential. And so equity across those classes so that everybody pays their fair share was the third most important value through these priorities. And you see those listed there. Now, we had an internal stakeholder advisory group too, which was representatives from the internal utility, representatives from our Department of Management and Finance, from the county manager's office. And that internal group, in addition to validating the 3 values established by the external stakeholders, they also said revenue stability is an important value for us as a utility and us as a community serving the community. And then at the bottom, you'll see a little footnote, which all of these values and everything we're doing today is built upon a really non-negotiable foundation, which is that the rate structure and the rate that we develop has to provide revenue sufficiency. This is what's called an enterprise fund. So we have to collect enough money to run the utility solely from the user fees. So that's revenue sufficiency. We have to have that. It has to be legally defensible. There are requirements, there are statutory requirements about how utility rates can be constructed. So it has to meet those requirements. And then we also have to be able to administer it, which means it has to have the level of we have to have sufficient administrative ability to implement it, which generally suggests it needs to have some level of simplicity for us to administer too. Let's go on to the next slide. So here I'm going to turn it over to our consultant. I think, Bart, you're going to take over at this point. Is that right?
Yep, that's right, Mike. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
So, as Mike said, our task was to, essentially take those prioritized values and then kind of craft that into a proposed rate structure that tries to align as best as we can with those values. So why don't we go to the next slide? Before I show you the proposed rate structure or talk about that, let's just spend a second kind of refreshing everyone's memory about the current rate structure. So on the sort of left side of this slide, the current rate structure in the county is entirely volumetric. So basically, we bill per 1,000 gallons of usage. And the current structure in fiscal 21, so that's the year that we're in, is for water, it's $4.91 per 1,000 gallons. For sewer, it's $9.29 per 1,000 gallons. And all customers pay the same rate. Now, one thing we had to think about when looking at the proposed structure is we're looking at a recommended rate structure that would go in place in fiscal 22, so the upcoming fiscal year. So As we're working through this process, we're also kind of forecasting what the revenue needs are in the system for fiscal 22. So we want to make sure we're making kind of an apples to apples comparison. So right now, based on current projections, and I'm going to caveat that in that the current budgets are not finalized yet. We're still working through that, but kind of what we're looking at, if we're just looking at the current rate structure and what we would need across the board is roughly about a 3.5% increase in rates. So that would bring the combined total up from 1470 from 1420. So that level of revenue is what we're targeting in the proposed structure. I just wanted to kind of remind everyone of that. A couple more things on the existing structure. So when you think about kind of the existing structure and as it stands now, a couple of things jump out. One, it's entirely volumetric, as I mentioned. There is no fixed component to the rate structure, and that's we do this all across the country, and that's pretty atypical. Most utilities have some kind of a fixed component. The other thing that jumps out is that all the customers pay the same unit cost. There's no customer class distinction. And so, if I could describe the current structure, it's very kind of simple and straightforward, but there's not a lot of sort of granularity to it. So let's look at the proposed structure. Now, again, basically what we're trying to do here is we looked at a number of different options, but we're trying to kind of align the recommendations as best we can with those prioritized values. So let me kind of step you through this. So what we're proposing is the establishment of what we would call a base charge. So that's a fixed component of the bill. And so for our commercial customers who are actually billed monthly, that would be $9.29 for water, $7.69 for sewer. For our residential customers that are billed quarterly, it would be $13.47 for water and $11.09 for sewer. Now, what goes into the base charge is basically kind of what I would call kind of the bare bones cost you'd put into a base charge. So things like customer service, billing, collection, meter reading. You have to pick up the phone, you got to send a bill out, you got to read the meter. It doesn't have anything to do with how much consumption someone uses. So those are the sort of first costs you would typically put into a base charge. Now, a lot of utilities actually put in a lot more costs into a base charge because really a lot of costs for utilities are sort of inherently fixed. But the fact that we don't have a base charge in place right now, we were kind of just looking at the initial costs that you'd wanted to put into a base charge, and that's what these dollars reflect. So then we look at the volumetric charges, a couple of changes to point out here. So one thing on the volumetric charges, we're proposing establishing customer classes. So we'd effectively have 3 customer classes. We'd have single-family residential, we'd have multifamily residential, and commercial, and I'll kind of step you through all 3. So in the single-family residential class, what we're proposing is to establish what we call a 2-tier inclining block structure. So the first tier, which would impact volumes between 0 and 9,000 gallons. And that 0 to 9,000 gallons is designed to target sort of non-discretionary, sort of essential water use in the home. That consumption would be billed at a lower unit cost of $3.84. Now, usage above 9,000 gallons per month, which is generally more related to elective type consumption, will be charged at a higher rate of $6.14 per 1,000 gallons. So it's effectively a 2-tiered inclining block structure where the unit cost ratchets up when you get above 9,000 gallons. So it's a more conservation focused rate structure. For multifamily customers, it would stay on kind of a uniform rate, but they'd have their own individual uniform rate, and that would be set at $4.57 per 1,000, and commercial will be at $4.95 per 1,000. Now, why are those two different? Well, they're different because those customer classes actually peak our system differently. Some causation in the water side is driven by how much a customer peaks the system. When we looked at the data, multifamily residential customers actually peak the system less than commercial customers, and so they have a lower unit cost accordingly. On the sewer side, we would maintain the same unit cost for the volumetric rates, but there is one important distinction to note in terms of implementation, it would affect kind of our single-family residential customers, and that would be establishing a different way to bill those customers. In the current structure, we bill our sewer customers the volumetric charge based on 100% of water consumption. So we don't have sewer meters on all of the customers, residential customers in the system, so we have to use something else as a surrogate. So right now we use 100%. Well, one of the issues that we heard in feedback from the community was, what about the water that we use that doesn't actually come back to the sewer system? Can't we recognize that in the rate structure? And some utilities do, and a good way to recognize that is as opposed to using 100% of water consumption, we would use the average winter period consumption. So that means the usage that a customer has during the winter months, which generally is a better proxy for indoor water usage or usage that doesn't return to the sewer system. So that would be a change for our single-family residential customers. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a couple of slides. We go to the next one. So looking at those values and looking at our rate structure changes, let's sort of see how those align, with those values. And I'm going to focus on sort of these four first, and I'll talk about this one here in a second. But as Mike mentioned, affordability, conservation, really important. Equity among customer classes important. Revenue stability was one from an internal perspective that were really important. So let's sort of step through these changes and see how that aligns. Well, looking at kind of first the base charge. Well, that base charge, does provide for some revenue stability, because right now all of our costs are recovered volumetrically. We don't have any stability in the rate structure from that perspective. So that base charge really kind of helps with that revenue stability. It also helps with equity among customer classes, because some of those fixed costs, as I mentioned, would now be recovered on a per account basis and not volumetrically. So it helps with that sort of class equity issue. If we go at the rates by customer classes, well, that really, does a nice job the way some of our analysis worked out in terms of addressing affordability, particularly that multifamily residential rate, which is actually lower now. And when we kind of drilled into some of the affordability challenges, what we found is a lot of the affordability issues in Arlington really probably reside in that multifamily residential sector, where a lot of those customers are renters and they're not direct customers of the system. So that will provide some benefits there. The two-tiered volumetric rate for single-family residential, and I should also mention, I apologize, that the establishing the rates by customer class also kind of addresses that equity among classes a little bit better. The two-tiered volumetric rate structure for single-family residential customers, because we've established that first tier, which is lower and kind of set for sort of base or essential uses and has a lower unit cost, that definitely has an affordability element in it as well. And it also has a conservation element, because it is a conservation-based rate structure. You get above that 9,000 gallon threshold and you're going to pay more. So there's that incentive to try to use water more efficiently. And the last one, because we didn't spend as much time talking about this in sort of previous, we did in the special topics meeting, but just to elaborate a little bit on the winter period, that really was driven largely from, if you kind of remember a few slides back when Mike showed, got a really good response in the 76 Engage sort of platform in terms of kind of to do engagement with the broader community. And there was an opportunity to provide a lot of comments, in the 76 Engage tool. And the most frequent comment that we heard was related to this sort of, I use a lot of water, some of it's, not coming back to the sewer, why am I being billed for it? So again, because of that, felt like we wanted to try to address that in the structure, and the winter period consumption change, his goal is to do that. Let me go to the next one. Okay, I know there's kind of a lot on here, and I apologize, it's a little bit hard to see. But the point of this slide is if you look at, this is sort of a comparison of rate design between Arlington County and some other local jurisdictions. And so the green is Arlington County. The top first row there is the current rate structure in Arlington County, which is just, again, a consumption or volumetric based charge. The row below it then represents the proposed structure, which goes through all the things that I just went through in terms of what the proposal is. So the kind of a takeaway here is that really the current structure in the county, again, it's very simple and straightforward. And a lot of these changes are sort of just kind of getting the county a little bit more aligned with what most other utilities in the area are doing. So it's not like we're doing anything that's drastically different from anyone else. Quite the contrary, we're actually just doing a lot of the things that would kind of get us to a similar situation to a lot of the other utilities. Why don't we go to the next one? Yeah. So this then too, the implementation of a base charge is again, because we don't have one now, and putting one in place, is something that we looked at, very closely. But just want to provide a little bit of perspective on that. Again, the top part here kind of shows, obviously the existing, we don't have any kind of fixed charge. And then the two rows below it show the proposed sewer and water base charges for the county. And if you look at kind of all these other, and some of these are, they're all utilities, some are more in the energy sector, but kind of local utilities, even at this proposed level of fixed charges, the county is still very competitive and probably on the lower end of things on a sort of a regional basis. And then, one thing I'll point out, if you look at, there's a different color bar down there, it's kind of a turquoise color. Our firm, Raftellus, does a national water and sewer rate survey. And on a national basis, the median fixed charge for water utilities is about $36, and for sewer utilities is about $40. So again, compared to that, we're not even really quite a third of that. So again, at this level of charge, we're still kind of very sort of on the low end from a comparison standpoint. Why don't we go to the next one? Yeah. So as I mentioned, I wanted to provide a little bit more context around kind of the average winter consumption, because we didn't maybe get into that in as much detail before. But long and short of it, what is the big concern here? As a concern, as I mentioned, that we received in comments is that, some of the water that's used for, purposes like irrigation, car washing, things like that in the summer months doesn't actually come back to the sewer system. And based on the current construct, where you get billed for the water unit cost at that 508, and you're paying $962 in the sewer for all of that consumption. And so, there is a little bit of a concern that, some customers are being overcharged that do peak the system a lot in the summer, and that there's some concern there from an equity standpoint. So what is a potential solution to that? And again, there's a lot of different options that are available out there. The most common option is to kind of to look at winter period consumption, because again, that does a better job representing sort of what indoor or domestic use would be. Another way to think about it is like the water that you actually use that does get returned to the wastewater system, and that's what we should be billing on. So then your consumption for sewer in the summer is going to be capped at that winter average winter consumption. And now this, a little bit more details on this. So this sort of average winter consumption, it's only is going to be applicable for single family residential customers. That's most utilities only do this for single family residential customers. Their usage tends to be more kind of homogeneous than non-residential customers, which you can have all different types, and the usage is sort of all over the place. What we're looking at right now is using winter consumption based on bills issued from March to May. The one complexity that we're sort of wrestling with internally is the fact that we currently bill for single family residential customers quarterly. So what that means is that we're going to have to look at sort of different periods of time for different customers depending on when they're billed. So the bills issued between March and May really reflects consumption, for example, for a March customer, because we bill in arrears. It'd be their consumption from December to February, and April customer from January to March, a May customer from February to April. So, one of the challenges that we're going to have to navigate through is that because of the fact that we bill quarterly, there will be some differences there. But looking at the data, these are the period of time that looked most appropriate to use. The other thing to point out with this is again, some of this is just a little bit more of, from a standpoint of being more equitable in how we're billing. But the reality is our costs don't change. So, because again, most of our costs are fixed in the system. So really what you do, when you're kind of calculating this, when you're doing a rate study, you're actually lowering the units, and then you have a slightly higher sewer volumetric rate. So I think that's just important to remember that the cost structure doesn't change here. But it is, again, this is an issue that comes up. So a lot of utilities will put something in place like this. It's used commonly throughout the region. Fairfax County, Prince William, Alexandria all do something similar. But as I noted before, the quarterly billing is one thing we're sort of working through, and then there's some other policy decisions that we're going to have to kind of work through and kind of communicate out to make sure that we're making this as equitable as we can. Okay, so let's look at some of the proposed impacts of the structure. So before we get into that, this is just, I know this sort of looks like there's a lot going on here, but this isn't as complicated as it looks. Basically what this is just a histogram. So on sort of the X part of the axis here is just usage, and then the Y part is the number of bills. So these bar charts just represent bills. So this is all the bills for our residential customers. I think we have roughly 32,000 residential customers. This is sort of the bill profile. So if you look at this and kind of break it down of sort of how our residential customers use water, at the first quartile, so that's up to 25% of the bills, is about 8,000 gallons a quarter. The median customer is about 12,000 gallons a quarter. At the upper quartile, which would be the 75th percentile, it's 18,000 gallons a quarter. At the 90% threshold, is 24,000 gallons, and you see it kind of has a long tail here, about 10% more use, kind of more than that. Why this is important is it helps sort of inform us in terms of looking at impacts and how customers are going to be impacted. So why don't we maybe go to the next slide? So what we're trying to show here and illustrate is sort of how these rate structure changes impact different types of customers. So the way we kind of approach this is we sort of looked at 5 different types of customers, and to try to give you kind of a representative kind of look at how things would affect customers. Now recognize that it's going to depend on the specific customer and their usage patterns in terms of exactly what the bill would look like, but this provides a general representation. And so what you're looking at here is an annual bill. And if you look at the bar chart, the blue part is the water bill, the green part is the sewer bill. So I guess a couple of takeaways here. Kind of on the lower end of the sort of customer usage is down in sort of 10th and 25th percentile of consumption. There is a bump up in what the proposed impacts would be. That's largely being driven by the implementation of that fixed charge, because we don't have one right now. We're coming off of such a lower level. So there is an impact there. And I'm going to talk more about that in a second to provide some perspective on it. The median customer, based on this particular bill, it's just a little bit higher than what it would be under the status quo. This customer here, if you can see their sewer bill is going down a little bit. That likely means that they had some peaking in the summer. There's a little bit of savings there on the sewer side, but largely their bill goes up a little bit, but fairly comparable to the current structure. I think where you can see that difference in peaking a little bit better is on some of the higher volume users. So on the left, sort of the 75th percentile is a customer that uses 72,000 gallons a year. And you can see this customer does exhibit more peaking, so there is some more savings there on the sewer side. In total, their bill goes down just slightly, but there's more savings on the sewer. On the water side, that's going up because they're hitting that higher level of consumption and paying more there, but they're seeing a little bit of a benefit on sewer. The highest usage customer here is a customer that actually just uses a lot of water all the time. And so that customer, you're seeing their bill increase on the water side as well as the sewer side. So they're kind of, the bill goes up the most in sort of these examples. But that provides a little bit of perspective on sort of the impacts that we're seeing. Why don't we go to the next one? Because I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about that low volume user. Because yes, establishing that fixed charge, that's one of the drawbacks in doing it is it does impact the low volume customer more. However, I think it's important to kind of look at that customer and sort of look where they are compared to others. So what this graph shows is kind of, again, looking at Alexandria, which is the green line, compared to these other jurisdictions that we've been comparing to. And if you go back to 2050, you can sort of see how this has been tracking over time. But that green line there, which is the county, you can see that it's sort of been hovering pretty flat, while most of the other jurisdictions have been sort of increasing over time. A lot of this, I think, has to do with, one of the issues we've talked about in prior meetings is, utilities trying to address some of the issues of declining per capita consumption. Usage has been really going down. Water consumption has been for some time. Prevalence and use of high efficiency fixtures, resource conservations, all those things are driving usage down. And customers or utilities that bill entirely volumetrically, that's been impacting them on the revenue side. So a lot of utilities have been looking at their fixed charges and trying to recover more costs in that to kind of promote that revenue stability. You can kind of see that sort of happening, I think, with a lot of these other utilities regionally. And in the county, we haven't done that because we've kind of preserved that uniform structure. But you can see the data line here then represents kind of looking out into 22 where we would be, with the proposed rates. You can still see we're actually still below where most of the utilities are, kind of where the fixed charge is proposed. Okay, I wanted to touch on impacts in a few other of the customer classes. Multifamily residential, and the differences here is you got all different types of multifamily residential. So generally speaking, what we're going to see with the proposed structure is multifamily residential customer bills going down, generally between probably about 1% and 3%. On average, you can kind of see what an average multifamily residential user is. The two representative customers we chose here to provide some differentiation would be, one is the Palatine, which is and I apologize if I get this wrong, but I believe it is a new large condominium complex with 250, 300 units or so. And you can see kind of their bill going down a little bit. The Key Garden Apartments would be an example of kind of a smaller kind of garden style apartment. I think actually this is a affordable housing community as well. And you can see their bill will be going down also. So generally speaking, again, multifamily residential bills would be going down some. Conversely, commercial customers, again, all different shapes and sizes of commercial. On average, their bill is probably going up between maybe 1% and 2%. This again just shows some different types of customers. One being kind of a large hotel in the West End, Class A office space, and then maybe a small sort of retail convenience store. But generally speaking, they're all kind of going up slightly. I do want to talk about affordability a little bit more because we did really try to drill into this, a good bit in the county, and kind of looking at affordability through a couple different lenses. One was sort of a traditional lens in terms of how we would evaluate affordability issues in the system, and kind of looking at some general proxies for measuring affordability. So at sort of the higher level, based on direct customers, there's not a systematic affordability challenge in Arlington that we can see, again, compared to sort of traditional ways of evaluating affordability. However, what we did find is there are pockets of affordability challenges within the community, but a lot of those challenges really live in the multifamily residential sector. And those are customers that generally are what we call indirect customers of the system. So they're served through a master meter and they pay for the utilities through rent. So they're not direct customers. And that's where we feel like really the burden lies. So through the rate design and having a lower rate for multifamily residential does at least provide some benefits there. Now the challenge is whether or not those benefits get passed through entirely to the tenants is unclear. But this is really kind of not just a local challenge, it's kind of a national challenge as it relates to how to help those sort of indirect customers. And there's really not a great national model yet to do it. There's some things that we're looking at, and some utilities are looking at to provide alternative ways to get to those customers. For example, partnering with other utilities that, like energy providers that do sub-meter those customers, is something that we're looking at. But there's really not a great model out there. So and through conversations that we had with the county social services department and some other organizations that try to provide assistance to this community, we think probably the best approach, an issue to kind of supplement what we're trying to do through rate design, is to kind of help through those existing organizations that can provide service to those customers, and kind of have the county sort of address it in that way while they're still kind of evaluating what other options might be available down the road. And I'm going to stop there, and I'll pass it back to you, Jason.
Thanks, Bart. We're going to have a couple more slides here that we're going to walk through in terms of what comes next for this process, just so that we're tracking before we open it up for questions. But I just want to acknowledge that a lot of information was just exchanged. So you heard from Mike sort of about where's the county been, how have we engaged in this process, what were the values that we identified, and how did we hear from you all as advisory group members to inform those values and prioritize them. And then you heard from Bart and the Raftelis team how they took all of that information, and along with the additional public comment activities that came in through 76 Engage, to craft the proposed structure that we just walked through. Before we turn for questions, I'm going to hand it back to Mike to just walk through the next steps around what public engagement will happen from here, and a potential implementation schedule, and then we'll open it up for questions from the advisory group, and then public comment after that. So Mike, back to you.
All right, thank you, Jason. So here we are, December 7th, on meeting number 5. Just presented this to you, as Jason said. Just last week, we went through a similar presentation with the county board members. And so we briefed them and showed them this data as well, and we've received their feedback. Meeting with you all now, we've got to update our internal advisory group team as well. Our intended next step, presuming that what we've shown you today makes sense to you and is consistent with how you think your community anticipated this study coming out, is that we would go into launch our next phase of public engagement, which would be seeking more feedback from the community about what their reaction to this proposed change is. We obviously are going to have to use different tools than we did in our first phase, so we're looking at doing Teams live forum. We'd go back to that 76 Engage tool, which was so useful for us earlier on. And then we'd also go back out and talk to the Chamber of Commerce, NIOP, and any civic federations that wanted to hear from us. So we go out and try to seek additional input from that. Presuming, and actually phase 2, if I could, is shown on this slide. Phase 2 would be then after adoption of the proposed rate. We would then engage in a pretty intensive public communications initiative at that time, telling people it's going to change, here's what it's going to mean, here's what you can anticipate. Let's go to the next slide, though, because so this, what we how the proposed changes would actually be adopted is they would be adopted by the board, and they would be adopted as part of our budget, as part of the board's annual budget adoption. And that's how we always adopt the rate. Rates always change by action of the board as part of their budget process. So the budget process in itself provides its own tools and its own methods for soliciting public engagement too. So we'll kind of have dual track going there for through the spring, getting feedback very specifically and very intently regarding the rate study, but the board will also be holding their traditional public hearings, to at which time we might they would be receiving feedback on the rate study outcome as well. Now, the last thing to look at on this slide is that we are anticipating, presuming adoption, presuming support from the community and adopting this proposed rate structure, it would be adopted with the board, with the FY22 budget sometime around April of this coming year. But we don't think we'd implement it July 1st. And that's because there are a lot of changes that need to be done both to our software systems, but we also have to kind of build out the policies and do some testing. So we would probably implement is January 1st of 2022 is what we're targeting right now. So think that's all we've got. Is that right? Is there anything else after this? No, Q&A.
Thank you, Mike. So we're going to open it up now to advisory group members for questions and comments. You know, it's been a chunk of time since last time we met, so hopefully we've refreshed more on where we came from and how we got to where we are, but would love to hear your reactions to the information you just heard or any additional clarifying questions, of course, that the team can address. If you're on mute, you can click the little microphone icon at the top of your webinar screen to unmute. Feel free to do that and just jump in as an advisory group member. If you'd like to click the raise hand icon, you can do that as well. That's the little hand you see at the top of the screen. Click that, you'll be entered in the queue. And of course, you can also use the chat function if that works best for you. But really would like to hear from you verbally if you're out there.
Looks like Nora.
Yeah, I like it. I think it makes great sense. I was just a little confused about the multifamily, what rates they would pay. On that first slide, it looked like multifamily had a higher base rate than the single family. And yet when you gave us the two, compared the Palatine with the Key, there was such a huge difference between the two multifamily structures that I'm just confused about why that is.
Sure. Yeah, maybe we could pull that slide up. Yeah. So
Yeah.
To answer your question, or a great question. So the base charge is not going to be different. It just depends on how those customers are billed, whether or not they're monthly or quarterly. But the volumetric rate would be the same for both those customers. The reason that the Palatine bill was so much higher is because they use a lot more water than the other customer. But they're both built on the same structure.
Oh, I see. So the Palatine might have, say, swimming pools and.
Well, they have a lot more units. So they use 635,000 gallons a month versus Key Gardens uses 71,000 gallons a month. Okay. I apologize. I probably should have clarified that when I went through it.
So that's the total bill, not
correct.
For an individual. Okay.
That's the total bill for that customer, correct.
Okay.
And one other thing to note on this versus the single family and townhouse residential, what we're illustrating on this slide and the commercial side, these are monthly charges. When you go back to the residential, they're billed quarterly. So actually, if you could flip back one slide, two slides, yeah, here. These represent annual costs for any single family home, and single family includes most townhomes and all duplexes. So this is showing annual costs for a family, whereas the other slides, the multifamily and the commercial, are showing monthly costs for that apartment management company or the homeowners association and a condominium.
Yeah, these multifamily facilities are on a master meter, so there's 1 meter for the whole complex. So for the Palatine is 230-ish units. So that water is coming through the 1 master meter, and then that bill goes to the management company, and they either include charges within the rent. They might have a separate company send out a third-party utility bill, but they're they end up being indirect customers for the county, since the county is not individually metering and individually billing each of those units.
Nora, does this help with your question?
Yes, yes, I understand it now. Thank you.
Thanks for asking, and thanks team for the additional information. Other clarifying questions?
This is Bob Wharton. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go for it, Bob.
Hi, I just had 2 points. I think just in terms of presenting this, it's a little confusing because it looked like the commercial was monthly, the residential was quarterly, so it's kind of hard to compare the numbers. Some of these numbers are annual versus monthly. So I think that might be confusing to people to try and figure out, you know, what you're paying and how it compares back. Then the second point is I think with the multifamily and the pass-through, you know, you mentioned this problem that the people who are actually going to be saving are the landlords, and it's not clear that they would have that they would be able to pass through to the renters, or that they would do that and rather just pocketing the savings themselves. I think that might be a problem, you know, when you're trying to present that to the community as this is an equity solution, because it looks like you're really benefiting the landlords rather than the low-income renters there. Those are my 2 points.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Bob.
And Bob, that was quite that we heard from at least one of our board members too, and it really is. It's just a dynamic of how water and sewer utilities are run. That those customers behind the management company or the HOA, they're just not our direct customers. But yes, that your concern there is correct. We don't have a way to force or leverage that. But we would point out though that we're at the least not providing any pressure on raising rates, raising rental rates or homeowner fees on that. And
yeah, one quick point. We were doing a study of this similar question on electricity rates in Washington. And one way to get around this problem of whether you benefit the landlord or the renter would be, instead of changing the rate for the landlord, you would put that money, the difference of the rates, into a community fund where you fund parks or other things like that, some sort of community benefit. So then you would target that money toward the community. Although that's a little more complicated, but it might achieve the goal that you're seeking here.
And I think this is Jason, the facilitator, and just as a point of process, I want to echo, Bob, your comment here. And I think the conversation we had during meeting 4, we had identified a number of different programs and ongoing county activities or activities that county partners implement to support underserved communities. So I think there's definitely some connective tissue here, and of course also a direct challenge in terms of the rate component and, you know, direct bills and who receives those bills. So it's good that we're naming this thing as you were seeing it, Bob.
Mm-hmm.
Also very appreciative of your first comment about the feedback for the PowerPoint presentation to either better standardize sort of the monthly versus annual, or better indicate on the slides and in the conversation where we're talking about what. I'm curious. Hytham, go for it.
Hi, I was wondering if on that chart that showed, I think you call it the histogram chart, if you could describe the rates for the different quartiles in that context versus in the ways that you've shown it here in some slides, which has different categorizations.
So this is just making sure I'm tracking the question, Hytham. So it would be, can we present information on the slide like this to include the rate structures at the various 1,000-gallon consumption marks? And maybe I can turn it to Bart there to maybe provide some of that assessment. And I also will just use this opportunity to remind folks that This is our discussion session for the advisory group members, and we'll be turning to public comment after this Q&A session. Thank you. Bart, if you can jump in here.
Yeah, sure. So I guess what we tried to do here, and it sort of links to the next slide, is just to sort of take these sort of different levels of consumption and sort of frame them with a customer at that level and kind of pulling actual bills for those customers. So this is sort of what that next slide tried to do. And here we just looked at kind of the 10th percentile, the 25th percentile. We didn't show the 10th there, but we showed the 25th, and the median, the 75th, and then the 90th. So we kind of added one more at the lower end, and kind of picked out customers at those levels, looking at their particular bills, and then tried to show that impact on the next slide.
Okay, so can I assume that the rates across that curve are linear, or are there jumping up points between different sectors? Like I'm trying to imagine how the
Sure.
rise, like uniformly versus just at different.
Yeah, sure. So with the tiering, that 9,000 gallons, the unit cost would go up above that. So, once you're above that 9,000 gallons per quarter, then you'll pay the $384 up to that point, but then it would increase above that. So the more you use above that, the higher that unit cost is going to be. So everything above 9 would get billed 6 and some change. I can't recall exactly the number off the top of my head, but yes, that's the sort of break point there.
And that's the only break point. There aren't other break points.
It's just a two-tier structure. Is what we landed on. Again, it was kind of a balancing act between, we did look at other options, and the two-tier structure was kind of a sort of a compromise of, trying to make it understandable for customers. There was a number of changes we were proposing, kind of going from pretty much as simple as you can get to kind of what we've proposed. So, it was kind of collectively determined that two-tier option, you kind of found that right balance between adding some additional complexity to the structure, but not going too far.
Ethan, does that help address your question?
Yes. What's the magic sauce with the lowest quartile? Is that what was the thought behind that being the breaking?
Yeah. So that 9,000 gallons, which is kind of roughly around there, the way that's built up was we do it kind of from the bottom up, and we use the American Water Works Association has a handbook of conservation, and so what it looks at is usage for basic needs, cooking, cleaning, things like that. And basically it estimates 45 gallons per day. So kind of 45 gallons per capita. And then what we do is we take that number, then we look at census data for the county. And in the county, the average people per household is, I believe, 2.18. So basically just build that up per day and then 30-day month, and you land just shy of 3,000 gallons a month. So that's how we got to the 9,000 gallons per quarter. So it's tied to kind of efficient water consumption, I should say.
Seems like an interesting point to share with a final approver, I think.
So making sure that we're communicating how we reached that threshold between the lower consumption and the higher consumption. So sort of the narrative that Bart just walked through, making sure we're communicating that.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm curious, just checking in with some of our other advisory group members that are on the line. Lily, if you're out there, wondering what your reactions might be to the conversation and the proposed structure.
Sure. Yeah, well, so I'm interested to see how it's going to affect the multifamily properties, because of course, I mean, that's most of who we're serving at AFAC. Are folks that are living in apartments that may not be the direct users. But I'm also curious because it seems like for single family homes, that's where you might have an increase in your cost. And so I'm wondering if there's been research or talks with DHS at all. I know they're busy nowadays, about assistance for folks who might be low-income single-family homes.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Lily. And we had talked with DHS back in the intensively back in the January and February timeframe. So before we all got really slammed, and DHS, of course, has been really running around. So we had had intense talks with them about trying to find direct customers, low-income customers, that were single family or direct customers of the utility. And at the time, we weren't able to really identify any significant population. And we did that by talking with them both about their experience, but looking through their records in terms of who had come in for utility assistance. And it was in the number of, it was around 10 or so that they had experienced over a couple years. So we had done some outreach to try and find that and determine if that was going to be a critical issue. And our immediate conclusion is it doesn't seem to be, but we have talked about that because there is, especially if you look at the percentage increase for those low volume users, it's a kind of jarring percentage increase. So we have had some internal discussion as this rate kind of as we formulated it about whether we might want to whether we would need to help build some assistance programs if that population is out there. That population of a low volume user that is also a low income user, and therefore this new rate structure would put some kind of strain on their affordability.
Well, I'm glad to hear that there weren't too many families that seem to be in that need. But of course, as with pandemics, with government shutdowns, with all sorts of things, you always have people who are moving into that need who may never have been there before. So I appreciate you guys looking into that.
Thanks, Lily, for the great question and sort of emphasizing that dynamic, and Mike for sharing a little bit more on sort of the analysis and data searching to sleuth that out. I just want to check in. I think there are two other advisory group members on the line that we haven't yet heard from. Peter Robertson, wondering how you're absorbing the discussion.
Well, I'm really pleased with what I've seen. I think you've done a great job, and I hope the county board will endorse it. Really sort of the only issue that occurred to me that hasn't already been addressed in questions was whether, now that we have a fixed charge as part of the recommendation, is there any concern that I don't know, some sort of event that we're not anticipating right now might drive costs up in a way that we won't be collecting, enough to support the costs of the system with a fixed charge that hasn't been increased, and obviously the usage will just follow what the usage is. Is that an issue at all, or am I worrying about nothing?
So this is just making sure we're tracking the question right. So given the fixed charge, which as Bart had shared sort of aligns with revenue stability, there could still be some external event that could occur that would significantly change the costs of the fixed things that fixed charge recovers. And would that put the county in a position where the system's not viable and able to recover costs? Is that right?
You asked my question much better than I did, Jason. Thank you.
Just channeling my Peter. Mike or Bart?
I think the bigger risk we face about what trends are happening in the industry is actually kind of the converse of that, where we're seeing consistently declining usage as a result of redevelopment and as a result of low volume plumbing fixtures. So you may recall, this was a long time ago, but we actually, when we project out our future consumption, we project consumption for the whole county to be flat despite an increase in population. So the fixed charge is really helping to buffer against that risk that many utilities are seeing, where their revenue is declining as their consumption is declining. So it's meant to address that. And then as for, is there anything out there we can anticipate that might overwhelm that fixed charge? There certainly isn't anything we can anticipate. And I guess maybe I'd turn it over to Bart and ask, have you seen anything that really worked against a fixed charge or overwhelmed a fixed charge?
No, I mean, I think the trend is definitely moving in the direction to either establish one or actually bump them up even more to be able to kind of stabilize that revenue stream. I mean, certainly the utility industry generally continuously faces pressure from a regulatory standpoint, from just aging infrastructures. There's a lot of costs that, whether or not we have fixed or volumetric, that we're going to see in the future. So the trend in rates is certainly directionally going up. But and that's why the county does a great job of kind of reevaluating and examining their financial structure on an annual basis, and you keep looking at that. And if you anticipate something that's coming, then you react to it accordingly. But no, the establishment of the fixed charge, that doesn't concern me in terms of being able to address that. I think it actually gives us more tools in the toolbox to be able to address that than anything else.
Thanks, Bart.
Sure.
Thanks for the question, Peter, and for the great conversation there. And may we hope that we don't have those kinds of curveballs find their way to us. I think Mike Mesner,
Raphael?
you may also.
Or am I the last one, or am I the second to last?
I was just making my way through the list, but
Okay.
jump for it, Raphael. Go for it.
Okay. Sorry, you said 2 more left. Well, anyway, thank everybody and all the other members for asking really smart questions. It really answered some of the same details I wanted on how the thought process behind helping, not overburdening citizens. So since I represent the homeowners, I think the only question I have now, I mean, is the county proposing automating more systems to bring costs down? I mean, what are the cost saving measures that we're going to do? Because eventually, if your revenue is going down, your costs stay the same, you got to bring those costs, or else you're going to have to increase the revenue to meet costs, especially if they start getting higher as inflation and stuff like that.
So yes, we're always looking to operate as efficiently as we can, and we're always upgrading our systems and updating our systems. We are looking at new metering practices, meter reading practices, which, to be honest, they're actually more intended to, it was alluded to earlier, we're looking at trying to get to a monthly bill for our residential customers, which we think would be a big benefit for a customer on the customer service side in terms of helping to address unanticipated consumption patterns, mainly water leaks, but preventing people from getting hit with really excessive bills unexpectedly. It also, nationally, when you look at the impact of going to a monthly bill, it really helps with families budgeting, getting, so you're paying monthly, not waiting for much bigger impact every quarter. So we're looking at efficiency improvements all the time, new systems, upgrading our systems, whether they're our asset management system or our centralized maintenance management system. I don't feel, and there are some exciting new metering and meter reading technologies that we're piloting, but to be honest, the next generation of meters has some real potential for manpower reduction. However, those of us that have been in the industry long enough have seen that every new generation of meters promised real efficiencies in operation, and they never quite totally hit those efficiencies. They give you a lot of new benefits and a lot of, they're good and real breakthroughs, but we've never quite hit that promised land of where now we don't need to actually have people out there managing meters and reading them. So this next generation's supposed to do it, but most of us look at it and go, it'll probably be much better and provide a lot of customer service benefits, but we're not quite buying that it totally, gets us out of that core piece of our business. So I don't know if that really answered your question. I think my best answer would be there's no silver bullet out there that says we just need to implement this and costs are going to drop.
They're looking into it, but there's nothing out there yet.
There's no silver bullet, but there is always incremental improvement. Go ahead, and Chris, I think you were going to weigh in.
Yeah, if I could just add, from a budget perspective, each year we do go through and we do ask, everyone to, take a hard look at the budget. Where can we see efficiencies? I mean, just, in the pandemic alone, so much of our work processes have changed. So not so much for us, since we have a lot of folks out in the field who have to be out in the field, but it's just another way for us to, let's revisit, let's look at things. Where can we tighten things up? Where could we find some efficiencies, maybe better ways of doing things? So we are looking at those on an annual basis, along with the rest of the county on the general fund side, but we are doing that on the utilities as well.
So appreciate you, Raphael, highlighting that point, and Mike and Krista sharing a little bit about some of the ways in which there are potential activities that can help and more direct things, and then the annual process that sort of forces us all to ask that question. Tracking through our discussion queue here, I think we haven't heard from Mike Mesner, I think has just joined us on the phone. And then I see Hytham and Bob have their hands up, and then we'll turn to public comment momentarily. Mike, are you out there, and any reactions you wanted to share?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, wonderful. I wasn't sure if I hit *6. No, thank you all very much for taking the time to put this together. This is very impressive, very transparent, very easy to follow. I don't really have any further comment. Everybody kind of took my questions, and just wanted to pass along. Great job. Mike, one of the comments you had made earlier about some of the metering technologies you're looking at, I got somehow signed up at one of my office buildings for that, I believe it's called Water Source.
Yeah.
Where I get like a daily reading. And I think one of my buildings got snuck in for the pilot. It's fabulous. I get to measure, our consumption on a daily basis, and for a 300,000 square foot office building, it's a really impressive technology. So kudos to you all, and allowing me to use it, and keep at it. It's great.
Well, Kevin Connolly, who's on the call here, is really the guy behind that, who put who made that happen. And
Mr. Mesner, I thought that was our little secret.
Well, it's a fabulous tool. I'm used to more on electrical meter reading, so this was my first foray into it, and it's been an extremely useful tool for us. So thank you.
Good.
Maybe Kevin and Mike can work out the kinks and benefits of that system in a commercial setting and figure out the future application in a residential world.
That actually is the next generation of meters that it's not, several years down the road, whether it's 4 to 10, we don't know.
Before we move to public comment, I see, Bob, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I just had a quick question. Sorry, I'm not sure if I missed this when you presented it, but on the single family housing, it looked like the only group for which the rates actually went down was the upper quartile. I was wondering if that's correct, and is that what you intended there?
Yeah, so it's dependent upon usage patterns, but generally there is a shift in cost to the broader single family residential class of customer. Individual customers, some customers will see slight savings, and generally it's in that 40 to 75 percentile of consumption range that might see cost savings. but it really depends upon the year. So for example, the median user there in the middle of the chart, we looked at 7 years worth of consumption for them. And I think it was 4 years that they paid a little bit more and 3 years they paid a little bit less. And likewise at the 75th percentile. As you get over to the right, the very high users, those were pretty consistently generally going to be higher. And as you get towards the left, they were generally going to be paying a bit more because of the base fee.
Mm-hmm. Well, it just looks like if one of the values is consumption, it's not translating here to the upper quartile, just the 75th percentile. So I don't know, just I think another, some people out in the public might wonder about that, because it looks like those people are getting a benefit here, whereas other people are paying more.
Yeah, and that's really the conflict we see between the equity among classes, between the conservation, and then also the really loud feedback we got from the 76 Engage tool about non-sewered water. So those three values are somewhat in tension with each other. I understand your point, though.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for highlighting that, Bob, both as a thing for us to track and also an opportunity to improve how we present information throughout the process here. We're going to shift to public comment. I don't see any other hands up from advisory group members. And we are just, we had to start a little bit late as some technical things ironed out, but do want to make sure we have some time for public comment. So we're going to open it up now to members of the public, and where you'll have a chunk of time here to share any comments that you might have. And then we will head towards wrapping up today and talk about our next steps. So you can click the raise hand icon on the top of your webinar screen if you'd like to share a public comment, and perhaps we'll ask you to keep it to about 2 minutes. With that, I'll turn to Barbara first. Barbara, if you'd like to jump in.
Hi, thank you. I'm Barbara Taylor from the Ashton Heights Civic Association. This has been a very helpful presentation and very clear. Just a clarification. When I get my water bill, I think of it as the water bill. I think this is what I'm paying for water, and I know that sewer is in there someplace. But I was surprised to see on the charts that we actually pay about twice as much for sewer under the current system and under the proposed system than we do for water. A couple of questions. Has this always been the case? Am I the only person who doesn't know this? And what's the reason for it? Is it just because it costs more money to run a sewage treatment plant than it costs to to send water through pipes? And am I the only person who doesn't understand this? Because if people look at these charts, they're going to think, wow. And especially since we're looking at basing the sewer cost on winter usage, so we can't explain it away by overwatering of lawns or something.
So I'll start with that and then ask Krista to really fill in why, how the costs are allocated and how the sewer costs more. Are you the only person that doesn't realize that? No, not at all. I think most people.
Oh, that's encouraging.
Most people don't realize that, but I'll tell you, when people get a lot smarter about it is during drought years. Whenever there's a drought and people are watering their lawn heavily, we start hearing that. Why are you charging me sewer? So that's when we educate a lot of people, is when they use a lot of water and then they start looking closely at their bill and realize that. Has it been that way always? It's been that way for a long time, both here in Arlington and nationally. One of the drivers of that here in Arlington was a major investment we made in the wastewater treatment plant back in 2000 to 2000. Well, we're still paying off the last of it, but we had a $500 million upgrade at the wastewater treatment plant back in the roughly 2003 to 2010 timeframe. I'll turn it over to Krista to fill in more about costs and anything I missed on that.
Yeah, you kind of hit the nail on the head, Mike. So I just pulled up a rate chart just showing the history of the water sewer rate. And back, my chart actually only goes back to the early 90s. And since then, it's been pretty consistent that sewer costs more than water. We purchase our water from the aqueduct. So for us, it's actually a very good economic deal to pay them to process the water and for their facility upgrades. And Mike hit the nail on the head with in the early 2000s, about 2004 was when we really started to see the double-digit rate increases on sewer because of the what we call the Master Plan 2001 project. So it was, as he said, a $500 million project or series of projects. It was a $568 million for the projects, and we're still paying off that debt. So we financed a lot of those projects over a number of years, and we actually will start to see a lot of that debt decrease over the next few years, which unfortunately it's just in time. It rolls off just in time for us to do a series of needed upgrades at the wastewater treatment plant on the liquid side of on the solid side of the plant. The original large upgrades were on the liquid side of the plant. But the rate is based on cost of service. So it does just cost us that much more to both collect the wastewater and then process it for release than it does to, buy the processed water.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you. Just one other quick thing. Will the slides be available online? The slides that have been shown in this presentation?
Yes, the slides from this presentation, along with a meeting record, a summary document, will be posted online to the
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And since we are recording this as well, we'll also make it available on the project page as well. So you can watch it back.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a lot of technical information. So we tried to cover everything. But it's a complex system with lots of moving pieces.
Moving through our public comment queue, I see two more hands up, and just want to encourage, if anybody else is out there and interested in sharing, please hit the raise hand icon now so we can track. Otherwise, I'm going to turn to our next speaker. Will be C. Creamy as a guest. If you could share your name and your comment.
Yeah, hi. Name is Giles Creamy. And can you hear me?
We sure can. Go for it, Giles.
All right. Wasn't sure. The question that I have is, it seems to me, after looking at all of this, that the major changes are that you're collecting the fixed costs. And I think that's a great idea. What I don't understand is, if you are covering your fixed costs, wouldn't that mean that the costs for water and sewer themselves, those rate costs, would go down in such a way that nobody, particularly the single family people that use the least amounts of water, end up paying more? I mean, I don't understand why there is not a quid pro quo on the rates versus the fixed costs, so that everything sort of is balanced in the end, and that nobody ends up really having to bear the burden of the fixed costs. That's my question.
Thanks for the question, Giles, and appreciate the analysis there on the fixed costs and sort of what does it mean. And maybe you can turn to perhaps Bart to share,
sure.
If I could suggest, in terms of the system responsibilities to deliver water beyond the minimum system requirements and a fixed cost.
Yeah, sure. So one thing you have to remember is we're looking at the proposed rate structure in fiscal 22, and you have to compare that to what the rates would be if we didn't change the structure in fiscal 22. And going back to that one slide where we kind of showed the existing and the proposed, the the fiscal 22 rates, the status quo, actually have a 3.5% increase in rates embedded in it. So the rates would need to go up to generate additional revenue if we didn't do anything. So we're targeting a higher level of revenue than what the current rates recover. So yes, you're right, we are recovering some of those costs on a fixed basis, and there is a reduction to the volumetric rates. They're lower than they otherwise would need to be. Like, so for example, if you look at the water rates for fiscal 22, right now the estimate under the existing structure, if we didn't do anything, would be it would go up to 508 per 1,000 gallons. And if you kind of compare it to the volumetric rates on the proposed structure, you know, other than the tier 2, which is, again, that's for the consumption above 9,000 gallons, for the tier 1, for multifamily and for commercial, you know, those rates are all lower than they would have been, because the proposed rate structure is designed to be revenue neutral compared to the status quo. But you got to remember, the status quo assumes a 3.5% increase.
Bart, I think one other thing that's important to note is that the fixed costs that this proposed rate structure would recover is limited only to meter reading and billing, and it's only about 3% of the annual budget. Actual system fixed costs are significantly higher than that. So we're only recovering a small portion of the system fixed costs through this proposed rate structure. So that's another thing to be aware of. So again, in total, it comes to, I think, a little bit over 3.5% of our overall costs would be recovered through those fixed costs.
Thank you, Bart and Mike, for sharing more about sort of the approach for those fixed costs and what they cover and then what they don't. And I know, Bart, you had also shared as you were walking through this slide that, you know, big picture and comparatively that base charge is smaller compared to other systems. So because this is new for the county, that was part of the approach, you know, to reflect the values that were identified to establish a charge that might fit more in lines with what was just described. Giles, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question and for sharing the time with us. I'm going to turn to our last individual in the queue, I believe Elizabeth Grossman, if you're out there.
Yeah, yes, thank you. I just have a couple questions, but can we go back to the chart you just had up with the proposed and current structure? That one, yeah. Why? I'm confused. Why, if the price is per 1,000 gallons, why does it matter if it's monthly or quarterly, the base charge?
The base charge is different monthly versus quarterly because, again, it's recovering the meter reading and the billing costs. So for our monthly customers, we're billing them, reading their meters and billing them 3 times as often as we are our residential customers.
But they're paying 13.47 per 1,000 gallons versus the monthly customers are paying 9.29 monthly for every 1,000 gallons?
So so the base charge is just a flat every month. And if you look at the far right column, you'll see that for the commercial and multifamily, every bill they receive, there's a flat fee of $17, which recovers the cost of.
No, I don't see 17. $16.98. Okay, I'm sorry. Yes.
And then likewise for our residential customers who are only billed quarterly, again, it's about $24.56 there that they would get billed for every bill that they receive, which comes quarterly for the residential customers. And again,
okay, I'm sorry, that was confusing.
Yeah.
Will the commercial and the multifamily have the get the sewer reduction?
No, that is only for the single family, and there's a couple reasons for that. I think the two most common reasons for that is one, single family use is generally relatively consistent across our 33. The patterns are kind of consistent. We know why and how people use water. On the multifamily and commercial side, it's very, there's just not a uniformity to how those very different buildings use water. So that's one challenge. And then the other reason is because all of our customers, whether residential or whether commercial multifamily, can get a second water-only meter. And as you get into the larger buildings, the commercial buildings, it becomes much more economically feasible for them to get a water-only account. And then they can choose the economies of scale work out better for them. So many of them will just choose to get another service line that will feed only their water consuming devices. Bart, is there anything to add on that?
No, I think you were spot on there. And that's why generally you just see that use for single family residential, and typically not for the larger customers, because again, usage is not consistent and there's alternatives, particularly buying irrigation meters.
What about condos? Do those qualify as multifamily homes?
They are multifamily. Condominiums are typically multifamily.
Okay, and I just have one more question. I'm sorry. You said the average usage families, it was 9,000 gallons per year?
The median is 12,000 gallons a quarter.
12,000 per quarter.
Mm-hmm.
And but you said you were marking off of, I'm sorry, I know I picked up somewhere along the line, someone said something about 9,000 gallons.
Mm-hmm. So the 9,000 applies to the tiers. And so the 9,000 relates to what we've estimated as efficient sort of indoor consumption. We build that up based on some information that's provided by the American Water Works Association. So it's basically built up from that. So we're estimating that 9,000 as being just sort of what's used essentially, inside the home.
Although the median is 12,000?
Because most people do use some consumption outside of the home, yes.
And you know this from what? What is that based on?
Again, just based on the data that we have, most customers in the system, while a lot of the usage would be indoor, again, based on our experience doing this, there is some outdoor consumption that exists.
And I'm sorry, one more time, please. That's per year or per quarter?
That's per quarter.
Thank you. That's all I had.
Thank you for your great questions, Elizabeth, and for everybody for sharing the time and carving it out of an evening here in December to join us for a webinar on the topic. So I think that's everybody that we had for public comments. So we're heading towards wrapping up our meeting. Maybe it would be helpful, Krista, if we could just bring up, I think it was slide 23, just to recap on our next steps. So today's meeting is being recorded, and the PowerPoint recording and summary of the conversation will be available on the advisory group website as soon as they're ready to go. This is our fifth rate study community advisory group meeting, and following this meeting, we're going to be moving into broader phase one rate structure feedback, which will include the Teams live forum, another use through Engage Arlington, the 76 Engage tool that you've heard mentioned quite a bit, the Civic Federation, and other advisories and commissions. And then it will move into pending those responses and board activities, potential adoption. And if adopted, then the phase two activities will begin to socialize a decision on the proposed rate structure. And per the next slide here on 24, just wanted to recap again that while the decisions will be made here as part of the FY22 budget process, as adopted, no changes would be implemented until January 2022. So everything here is stacking up through a great process, and just extremely thankful I can't speak for the county, but on behalf of Process, for the advisory group members' participation in these series of meetings to take the time to learn more about the county's water system, how the rates come to be, comparable rates, provide the input into values and prioritizing those so that Bart and the Raftelis team can come up with a proposed rate structure that best meets the county's needs. With that, I'll turn it over to Mike for any closing comments and to close us out.
I would just, sorry, was someone else in there? All right, I'd just like to thank our advisory group members for all their work to date. It's been critically important. And so I think we're gonna then take off and take the next step on our public outreach. And I think we'll probably want to get back in touch with you guys as the rates, as the advisory group, and find out if you wish to have a hand as we conduct that outreach. We would certainly welcome it and appreciate it. But in the interest of time, of everybody's time, I think we ought to close up this meeting, and then we can reconnect in the coming weeks to figure out what continuing role you all would like to play in this effort.
So just making sure to name that clearly as an action item and emphasize that if you're interested in continuing to support the public outreach that will happen in the phase 1 process around 76 Engage and a broader Zoom, Teams live forum, please, if you're an advisory group member and have those interests, reach out. There'll also be some email follow-up offline with the advisory group as we continue to advance these activities. If there aren't any further comments, I believe we are adjourned. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time this evening.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate the intelligent and thoughtful conversation.